Hey everyone, Sycra here, and in this video I'm going to talk about finishing filters and effects in Photoshop. Now this is specifically for Photoshop because that's a program I use most for this stuff. I'm sure there are other ways of modifying these techniques for other programs, but personally I prefer using Photoshop for post-production stuff. Even if I'm using a program like Clip Studio, I like to use Photoshop for this end game stuff. And there's a bunch of different ways of achieving the same things as I'm going to show you. So don't feel like, oh, this is the only way to do it, because there are a ton of different ways. Or if you know easier ways, I mean, feel free to write it in the description or point towards a link of a person who's doing the same thing better. There's, as I said, a ton of different ways of doing all these things in Photoshop. And finally, a big disclaimer. These techniques, these filters and stuff, these effects, they're not going to make a bad painting good. So these aren't even the icing on the cake. These are the sprinkles on top of the icing on the cake. And if you don't have a good cake underneath and good icing, it's not going to help. But if you do, it's nice, it finishes things. So, yeah, let's get started. So I have this image I've made, and it's just, paintbrush, using de Harm's brushes again. This one is the one I tend to use. He has like a bunch of different types, and on paint I use this brush to paint with, mostly anyway. Looks like that, so I use that one. But brushes, whatever, it doesn't really matter that much. But for this, for these effects, I tend to use just a default soft brush, and I make sure it's really big. Now my image size is 3300 by 2550 pixels. So it's kind of big. It's not super big. It's not super small either. I would say this is a decent size. I like to keep my images around 3000 pixels-ish on the large side, at least. And this is just because brushes work better on larger canvases, and so do effects. So the first effect I'm going to show you that I usually add to all my images is I make a new layer and set it to overlay, and I add in color variation. So if I was drawing a figure, what I tend to do is I usually make it like more yellow at the top, and I'm going to exaggerate this, and then I get towards like a red in the middle, but less saturated, and then I go down, and you'll notice, see I'm moving this color slider thing, and I go down towards like purples and blues, and then at the bottom I have like a blue. So that's pretty extreme. So I usually, if I do something like that, I'll knock it way down. And this is pretty much for most of the techniques. It's a case of doing something on its own layer, and then turning the layer on and off, and also reducing the opacity until it's the right amount. So let's say, I mean, that's a bit overkill. That's not always what I do. I'll also use overlay layers for, let's say I just wanted the cheeks to be a bit more red. I might use an overlay layer for that. And I make sure my brush is humongous. This is really important, that your brush is big. So see, like that, just adds a bit of warmth to the cheeks, or a bit more warmth. Could add that to the lips. Let's say I wanted like a bit of color variation in the hair, maybe just a bit of green. I'll make it big, and I'll often tap in some of this color, and I think you experiment and you figure out what works for you. That's how I learned it anyway, just, trying different colors and different things. So there's no real formula to any of this. Most of it is just do whatever you want and see if it looks good. And then it's a matter of turning it on and off. Like, is this getting better or is this getting worse? Let's say I like that, but maybe it's a bit too strong. So just dial it down until it's there, but it's not too strong. And the rule I go by is you don't want to see the effects, but you want to feel the effects. So when I turn it on and off, it's like I feel the difference more than I see the difference. So subtlety is really important to me. Now, another effect is similar to that, but it's with color dodge. And what I do is I set the layer to color dodge, and then I double click on this, and this layer style window comes up. And that appears if you see where it says the name of the layer. If you click beside the name, double click, this comes up. And I uncheck these two boxes, blend clip layers as group and transparency shapes layer. And then with color dodge, it's something that you really have to know how to use it for it to come across properly. Otherwise things get blown out really fast. So a beginner mistake is they'll pick a color that's very bright, or a value that's very bright, and they'll paint it in, and immediately it blows everything out. Now, that might be the effect you're going for, but to me, it's not subtle. It's too much. So what you want to do with color dodge is actually desaturate your value almost to black. Keep it at a very low value. And then when you paint, it lightens things, and it also saturates things, but in a much more subtle way. And you can also add color to that. So let's say I wanted to add a bit of warm, like a warm yellowish golden light, right? So instead of actually going towards this gold color, which is going to completely blow everything out, I'm going to go towards almost pure black and then just saturate it a little bit. And now if I add that, it's going to warm it up, but in a very subtle, pleasing way. And if I turn it on and off, you'll see, you don't necessarily see the effect as much as you feel the effect. So now it does feel a lot warmer in that face. And something else that's really important is layer masks. I use these all the time. So the layer mask button is this one. It's like a white rectangle with a black circle cut out of it. And if you click that, it makes a mask. And now what it means is it's just white, right? But whatever is white is what's going to show up in this layer. And whatever is black is what's going to not show up. But you can also have gradients. So for instance, let's say I didn't want that yellow to show up in the eye region. I can just paint black in that area. And then now it only affects the areas that aren't black, which are the white areas. And it's called non-destructive editing. And the reason is that I can just switch back to white and repaint it in, and then it's all back. So it's really useful in terms of, like, layer masks are really useful because you don't have to worry about erasing something and not being able to fix it. And you can create a lot of subtle value shifts if you use grays and stuff instead of just white or black. So now we have a bit of light here, and I think that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna lower it again because it's a bit strong. Till about here. I like it around here. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is vignetting. Now, this is something that there's, again, a lot of different ways of going about doing this. One of the easiest ways is you just get a huge brush, you set the layer mode to multiply, and pick a color that's pretty desaturated and pretty light. So we're going the opposite of color dodge, and I'm just going to shrink this. And a quick way of shrinking, if you aren't familiar, is if you hold the control key, or I guess it's command on a Macintosh, and you press the minus or plus keys. If you press minus, it zooms out, plus zooms in. So with this, like, let's say I'm going to add a bit of color. So it's not pure gray. It's like warm. Maybe it's more towards red. Make my brush big, and then just going into the corners really vignettes this, and it makes it so you now look towards her face. So here's a before, after, before and after. So that's something I like to do. And then if you want it darker, you can always do that, darken the areas. But again, I tend to focus on the corners and then leave it bright at the focal point. And like everything else, you can lower the opacity of this or keep it pretty high. I think that's a bit much, but that's pretty okay. I think something like that's okay. So yeah, you've got that. Another way of doing this is to use lighting effects. And what you have to do with that, though, is you need to have a copy of this layer. So the way I make a copy is to hold down Control, Shift, Alt, and E, and make a new layer, and then Control, Shift, Alt, E, and that just copies everything that's underneath into its own brand new layer. And then you go to Filter, Render, Lighting Effects, and it'll bring up like a new window, and this gives you like a light, and you can move it around, you can adjust it, how big you want it, adjust the shape of it, and yeah, I mean, similar to what I was doing with the multiply layer, but it's a bit, I guess you get more control in some ways, just play around with it until you see something that looks good. Let's say something like that. Okay. And then just hit OK, and there you go. So that's with lighting effects, and this is with multiply. So it's really up to you. I guess the lighting effects are more correct. But with the multiply layer, I get to screw around a lot more. Like, let's say I wanted not just the corners darkened, but just certain areas, maybe under her neck and stuff, using a multiply layer makes that easy. So here's the multiply layer, and here's the lighting effects layer. Okay, so the next thing is sort of similar to vignetting, but it's blurring. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the thing again, Control, Shift, Alt, E, or Command, Option, Shift, E, I guess. And now I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and there's a bunch of different blurs you can use. I'm just going to use Lens Blur. And you can adjust all these little sliders. So it could be more blurry or less blurry or whatever. And let's just say I wanted it like that. Okay, so now it blurred everything, but you don't want everything blurred, right? You want some areas to be blurred and some areas to be in focus. So what I can do is put a layer mask on that. So now see, everywhere that's white is going to show. Again, get my big soft brush, get black, and then erase by just painting black in the areas that I don't want to be blurred. And so she's more, in focus in her features, but less around her hair and stuff. And so to go on and off, it looks like this. I don't know how well this is going to show on YouTube, because YouTube, whenever you record a video, it already gets a bit blurry. But if I zoom in, it should be easier to see. See how it just gets a bit blurry around the outside? And that's generally something I find appealing, to make sure the focal points are in focus and everything else is a bit blurry. So that's definitely something that I like to use. What else? Okay. So another thing to do is adjusting levels. And the way I like to adjust levels, or you can also adjust curves, is using an adjustment layer. So an adjustment layer is beside this layer mask, there's like a half white, half black circle. And if you click that, you get this these options. And one of them is levels and one of them is curves. And if you click levels, you can move these sliders and adjust how bright and how dark things get. And that's really useful if you want to add more contrast or have less contrast. But one of the things that's really cool about it, I find, is when you sort of reduce the light. See how it sort of looks like I just turned the lights down from here to here? So that's step one. Then the next step is to, well, you can do it one of two ways. If I just fill this, because adjustment layers automatically come with the layer mask. If I fill the layer mask with black, it turns it off. But then I can use white, and I can sort of use this like a multiply layer and just paint white where I want it to get a bit darker. So let's say I want you to focus on this area, right? Like this middle section. Well, I can just use a big soft brush, and then you, because I've got this levels layer on, it now focuses your eyes towards the center like that. So that's really nice. Another thing you can do, which I use less, is curves. Curves is like levels, but much more advanced. And it gives you these two slider things, these gradients. And what it's saying is take this value and turn it into this other value. So right now, the line goes straight across, right? So what that's saying is white here on what's showing as white is going to show as white. And what's showing as black is going to show as black. And what shows as gray is going to show up as gray. But if you click this, you're adding points, and then you can move these around. So now what I'm saying is, what is this value, turn it into this value. So it's turning gray much more like white. And you can do a lot of weird things by moving these around. And they're pretty cool. Pretty cool effects. So, yeah, if you do crazy stuff, like you take black and you're telling the computer, okay, take black and change the value to lighter, then it gets really, can go really crazy like that. And again, that can be cool as an effect. Or you could go the opposite, and you could say, what's supposed to be white is now going to be black. But I like it much better when you go near the end and you make these types of adjustments with curves. So it's just something to play around with. Like, that looks pretty artistic to me, artsy fartsy. And you can, again, lower the opacity. If you want that to just show through a bit, you could do something like that, and then it's okay, it's showing a bit. And on top of that, maybe throw in like a color dodge layer, make a big brush, huge brush, and I can like sort of brighten this area even more, so it looks like there's a light hitting here. See, before and after. So again, another technique you can do. Now, something I like to do as well is this other thing, which is a lighten layer, which has a similar effect. What you do is you make a new layer and you fill it with a fairly dark color. Let's just say like this dark green, okay? And then you set that mode, the layer mode, to lighten. And what that's doing is anything that is darker than this dark green that I put. So if I pick it, anything that's below, that's darker than the color I put, is going to get lightened to that color. So right now, if I bring the lightness to 0, it's filled with black. So nothing is getting lightened, because it's saying anything that's darker than black which is nothing. There's nothing darker than black. Turn it into black. And so we don't want that. But now what it's saying is anything that's darker than this dark green, turn it to this dark green. And you can get some pretty cool results like this, because it just, for me, what it does is it knocks the edge off the top of the bottom of the value range, where maybe you don't want something that's pure black and it's just a bit too strong and you want it to be a bit lighter. Like even something just like that, it can add a bit of warmth to your darks, see? And it can also, again, take the edge off. But I usually don't like using this lighten layer because I prefer this other method if I do this type of thing. And it's similar to the curves layer I was showing you. Again, let's just fill it with this, this color. And then I'm going to set the layer mode to difference. And it creates this cool effect. Now, that's the first part. And then you hit Control U to bring up the hue and saturation slider. And you can change the lightness. And as long as it's not pure black, because if it's pure black, nothing's going to show up. You can adjust these sliders and create a lot of cool effects. See? Ooh, you have a different mood as you cycle through them. And you can get really light and then have this negative of the image. Or you could just keep it, subtle. And what you can do is, let's say I like that. See how I've got this rim light sort of happening? So what I can do is hit that and then hit OK. Then make a new layer and Control-Shift-Alt-E. So now what I've done is I've copied whatever's underneath here. So see, this is the old one, this is the new one. And then you can change the layer mode of this to lighten, or, you can do this and then see how it adds that on top. So it's kind of, changing the colors. I don't know how to explain it, but you can see it, right? It looks kind of cool. And you can fool around with that with hue and saturation, add that in more or less. And you could put it like this much and it's a bit too strong, and then just lightly bring that in. And it'll sort of give everything a more washed out look. But again, it can be pretty interesting. So that is something I like to play around with. But these are pretty optional. So, things like that. And I prefer the one with the curves, but you can stack these as many times as you want. And it's just, one more thing you can do. Okay, now there's another thing I've been playing around with lately, but I can't take credit for this because you use gradient maps. And I've been using gradient maps a lot. Basically what you do is you create a new adjustment layer and then go to gradient map, which is the second from the bottom. And then it brings up this thing and you click it and you have your gradients, the normal Photoshop gradients. And by clicking them, that actually looks really cool. These are just the default Photoshop gradients. You can come up with a bunch of different cool patterns. Like let's say I like this one. Okay, so I click OK. Then what I can do is I can lower the effect of that. So it just barely has an effect and it shows up and it's pretty cool. And you can also play around with different layer modes. See? You never know what you're going to find. So it's cool to just try stuff. That's neat. Yeah, so you can do that. But why I said I can't take credit for it is because I started using this guy, Arthur Gemaldinov. He came out with a bunch of gradients that are really interesting. And I just they're cool. So you can make stuff look like gold. And I'll post a link to his channel in the description, and you can see his stuff. These two I made before I saw his videos. And basically, I just wanted things to have like a pastel look to them. So I just built this gradient where everything becomes pastel-like. And the idea was you just turn it way down and you add it in like just a bit, and then you've got like this pastel-ish look. But the Arthur Gemaldenov gradients are really cool because the way he uses them is he uses them for specific materials. And I don't know, you got to check out his videos. I'm going to, definitely check out how he uses them because it's cool. Yeah, that's nice. All right, so that's another thing you can do is gradients. And yeah, all right, enough of that. That's so cool. Anyway, okay, so after I get like all this, let's say this is the level I'm happy with. The next thing I do is I will add noise to this image, and the way you do that is just make a new layer, fill it with, usually I just fill it with gray, it doesn't really matter, and go to filter, noise, add noise. Now it gives you an option, and one is to have monochromatic noise, and one is to have like colorful noise, where if you zoom in, it just adds like a bunch of color. And so you get this. Either way is fine. I like using both for different reasons. But what you can do is you can add this colorful noise and then click Control A to select all, and then Control T. And then holding Shift and Alt and clicking in one of the corners, you can make this a bit bigger. And the reason is if it's small, the texture is there, but it doesn't show up as much. So by making it a bit bigger, by expanding it, it shows more. So you've got this texture. Then what you do is you can set this to a bunch of different modes. The one I like to use is soft light, but you can set it to overlay or screen or a bunch of different things. And as it is right now, it's way too strong. So I usually turn it down to like 7%. For the sake of this, because it's a YouTube video, it's probably not going to show up that well. So I'm going to turn it to 30%. And then when you zoom in, you can see how it just adds this grain over the entire image. And that just makes it feel a lot more cohesive, especially if you're using something like photo textures and you're mixing elements. I don't really use photo textures, but if you are mixing things or some areas are painted and it just doesn't feel connected, this is one of the ways to make it more connected. Just put a noise layer on. And then there's another noise thing that I do myself, which, I don't know, it's not really great. But anyway, I go filter, noise, add noise. I make it monochromatic. And then what I do is I hit Control. Okay, I make a new hue saturation layer. And then I'm going to turn that off. And I'm going to hit Control A to select all on this layer. And actually, I should make it bigger first. So Control T, Shift Alt, make that bigger. Okay, now Control A and then Control X, which will cut that. And then if I hit if I hit Q, I go into Quick Mask mode, and then Control V will paste that into Quick Mask mode, which makes it so everything that's black is going to not be selected and everything that's white is going to be selected. Then I hit Q again, and now I've got a selection of that. It's probably sounds complicated, but just select all, cut, hit Q, paste, hit Q again, and you'll get this. And then I can go into my hue and saturation, and I can fill it with black, because right now it's all white. If I fill it with black, it's filled this hue and saturation with that same noise. And then what you can do is you can subtly change this and the sliders, and what it's done is like, it's not going to show up well unless I zoom way in. So let's zoom way in to this. Okay, so what it's doing is it's just changing the colors ever so slightly, but each pixel is actually being changed, or the pixel surrounding it. So I'm just shifting it, and what you can do is increase the saturation or decrease the saturation. Let's say I wanted it all to be a bit more saturated. I can do that, but it's not affecting all the pixels, but just some of them. So it creates like a noisy effect that can be interesting. But again, it's not something you have to do. And again, you can also turn it down if it's too strong, you know. And you can add your other noise as well on top. And pretty much, you know, that's what I do. And then at the end of everything, I always make a new color balance. I almost always make a color balance adjustment layer. So again, click that circle, half white, half black, go to color balance. And what I usually do is I usually turn the shadows towards red. So I warm up the shadows basically, and I bring the highlights towards a blue. So I cool the highlights and I warm up the shadows. And then for midtones, I just slide back and forth and I see like, is it better, is it worse? Like what mood am I going for? And that's pretty much it. Just harmonizes all your colors. So something like that. And if that's too strong, again, just lower the opacity of that until it's at a level you're comfortable with. Like, let's say that. Okay. And then, just because, and there are tons of ways of doing this, but I'm just going to show you a chromatic aberration, because, you know, all the young kids are doing it these days. I'm just going to copy this, Shift Control Alt E to make a duplicate of this layer, and then Control J, which makes a duplicate of that whatever layer I was just on. And then the way I do it is I go to Channels, and you'll see here, if you don't have this tab, go to Window, Channels, and check that the Channels tab is on. You have RGB, red, green, blue. I select one of these, doesn't really matter. I select usually red, and then what's happened is it's turned everything black and white, and then but it's also selected just this red channel, and then I press the eyeball beside RGB, and it's still only selecting the red layer, but now I can see all the layers. Then I hit Control A and Control T, and now I can adjust this. And what I do is I hit Shift Alt, which makes it so if I go to one of the corners and I hit Shift Alt, my cursor changes like to this arrow thing, and then when I scale it, it's going to scale, you know, like that. And I just make it a touch bigger, and then it gives that chromatic aberration-y effect. And then I've created another layer, so you can do it before and after. See? It's not much, but it does something. See? Just gives it a little bit of that glow. So this is without, and this is with. And then often what you'll do is you put a layer mask on that, and then just erase this in the middle. So just select black and a huge brush, and then sort of click out the areas in the middle, because this effect is around edges, but it's so, I think it's overdone. I think there's way too much chromatic aberration going on, so I'm a bit afraid to show this because I don't really like it anymore. I think it's just been abused way too much, but yeah, that's one thing. And then something that I guess this is a last thing, and this is just something that I've been doing to my pictures, but I don't think it's like the coolest thing ever. It's just a thing that I like. I make a new layer. Shift Control Alt E. Don't copy this because it's just to give you an idea of things you can do. I mean, you can copy it if you like it, but whatever. Okay, whatever. Not important. What I do is I like to add like a pixelation to it. See, like this. It just pixelates everything, and I like it. I like the look of these pixelated things. I don't know why, but I like them. I think they look nice. Like, I prefer it this way. I think it looks better as an image, but I just think people would be like, oh, it's very low res, but it's not low res. It's super high res. But I don't know. But anyway, I wanted to be more cool because I thought, no, just squares. That's not cool. I need to be more pointy, not square. Like, so what I started doing is I zoom way out and then I crop the image. So like that. And then I select this layer, Control T, and I rotate it 45 degrees. And then I add pixelation to that. Okay. And then Control T, and I rotate it back to where it used to be. And then I click on the old layer and image crop. And what was all that for? Why did you do that? Well, because now I don't have squares. I have diamonds everywhere. It's just... okay. I am not smart. Okay, so that's a way of getting diamonds everywhere. And I don't know, I think it looks nice, but I usually feel self-conscious about doing this because it's sort of cheesy. So what I do is I then lower the opacity of that so it just shows through enough. See? You can see if you zoom in, there's little diamonds everywhere. But if you zoom out, it's not that much of a difference. Here's before and after. But I don't know. Yeah, basically that's it. Let's just go through a full before and after. So these are all the effect layers, and this is without it. So before and after, before and after. So, you know, it adds something. It's not absolutely necessary. I don't think this is terrible. It looks a bit unfinished. But I mean, you can solve everything with just pure painting alone. You don't have to go into all these. But if you do, you know, again, can make things look a bit more finished. So for anyone who wants to know how to add sprinkles to a cake, this is how. And I hope it helped. And thanks for watching.